Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. This is the story of an attachment to an entity I call Hefe. This story spans almost 2 decades and more than 2/3 of my life. I am what you could call an elder in a young body. I'm 27 years old, but on the tail end of my second divorce, wrapping up years of traumatic events and misfortunes and life lessons in prolific numbers. I'm beginning to tie together some of this misfortune and trauma to the existence of an attachment between Hefe and myself. I cannot tell you exactly what Hefe is. I wish I knew for sure, but I can tell you what it looks like, what it does, when it does it, how it sounds, and where it hides. I can't even tell you why or how it became attached to me. I was a child when this began, at only 10 or 11 years old. When I was around 10, my dad and I went on a camping trip to Yosemite. My mom didn't join us on this trip. We'd gone on many trips before as a family, lasting around a week each time, and oftentimes at Big Sur or Yosemite. We pulled into the park having already had a small debate in the car about food and music. I was ready to call my mom because I was already homesick. Though being older now, I think I just missed my mom. She and I could hold a normal conversation. To this day, my dad and I have these debates about mundane and trivial topics. We never stay mad. If we ever even do get mad, a majority of the time our debates are for the sake of debating. I guess that seems to be our best method of communication. Anyway, we stopped at some place my dad had to check into. We were staying in some sort of cabin by a location of a historic rock slide. I don't remember as many details as I wish I did. This can be attributed to a series of concussions resulting in a TBI or traumatic brain injury. I do remember that we walked over to an area with a phone. My dad dialed my mom and I'd begun, as many young children do, to jump around and wander and mess with things. The air felt thick around me, heavy with something I couldn't name. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper than they should have been in broad daylight, and every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl with an inexplicable unease. I don't recall having wandered off too far, but I suppose I had as my dad called my name with a hint of both irritation and fear in his inflection. The sound of his voice cut through the oppressive atmosphere like a knife, and I felt a sudden overwhelming urge to run back to him. So I trotted back over to where he was, my heart hammering against my ribs for reasons I couldn't understand. He handed me the phone so I could talk to my mom. As I was on the phone describing the strange feelings I'd been having to my mother, I felt a searing pain on the back of my right thigh, and I suddenly cried out. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, sharp, deliberate, and burning like someone had taken a red-hot blade to my flesh. My dad came over and shouted at me for messing around beside the phone and causing me to cut myself. In a state of confusion, I asked my dad what he was talking about. The pain was so intense it made my vision blur, and I could feel something warm and wet soaking through my jeans. He prepared a first aid kit from the red backpack he always had on him, something he still keeps with him to this day. He asked for the phone back. I told my mom I loved her, my voice shaking with pain and confusion, and handed it back to my dad, who handed me the first aid kit, asking me to clean the cut on the back of my thigh. I sat down on the ground, and in the most awkward way conceivable, I lifted my right leg with my arm and searched for this alleged cut. I indeed did have a cut, though as deep as it was and long as it was, that word feels like a joke. The wound stretched nearly 4 inches across the back of my thigh, deep enough that I could see the fatty tissue beneath. The edges were jagged and torn, as if something with claws had raked across my leg. But there was nothing around me that could have caused such damage. No sharp rocks, no broken glass, no protruding metal. The strangest part was that the wound was perfectly positioned in a place I couldn't have reached myself, even if I'd been trying to hurt myself, which I wasn't. The angle was all wrong, as if something behind me had deliberately slashed at my leg while I was distracted on the phone. I took out the alcohol swabs as my dad taught me to do many times before. The moment the alcohol touched the wound, the burning sensation intensified beyond anything I'd ever felt. It wasn't just the normal sting of antiseptic on an open cut. This felt like liquid fire was being poured directly into my flesh, spreading outward in waves of agony that made my teeth chatter. I proceeded to scrub the ever-living tar out of my leg while biting my lip to hold back tears which inevitably spilled over anyway. The blood kept coming, no matter how much I cleaned. It should have clotted by now, but it continued to seep from the wound in thick dark rivulets that stained the ground beneath me a rusty brown. After scrubbing for what felt like ages, watching the crimson mix with the dirt at my feet, I packed the cut full of Neosporin, like my mom always prompted me to do. She carries the stuff everywhere and uses it on everything. Acne, Neosporin. Cut, Neosporin. Cracked lips, Neosporin. Even if the dog cut their paw pad again, it's Neosporin time. By this point, my dad had finished the phone call and was now squatting in front of me. His face had gone pale when he saw the extent of the damage, and I could see his hands trembling slightly as he examined the wound. I can recall him mentioning stitches and me shaking my head like a mad person with wide eyes. The thought of needles and thread being pulled through my flesh made me feel sick to my stomach. My dad let out an exasperated sigh. Being queasy around blood, he whipped out a massive band-aid. But when he tried to pull the edges of the wound together, they wouldn't stay. The gash was too deep, too wide, and every time he pressed the bandage down, fresh blood would seep out from underneath, creating dark stains that spread across the white gauze like ink in water. He used multiple bandages, layering them one on top of the other, but nothing seemed to stop the bleeding completely. These were the fancy watertight band-aids my dad saved for emergencies, because I was known to be found in creeks, mud, trees, or some other area, likely teeming with dirt, debris, and the germs my parents were so wary of. But even with all the medical attention, something about the wound felt wrong. It throbbed with a pulse that didn't match my heartbeat. And when I moved wrong, I could swear I felt something shifting beneath the bandages, as if the cut was deeper than it appeared, extending into places it shouldn't be able to reach. Our trip carried on afterward, but the carefree atmosphere had been shattered. Every step sent jolts of pain up my leg, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, as if expecting to see whatever had hurt me lurking in the shadows between the trees. The wound refused to heal properly, festering despite our careful attention, and developing an odd smell that made my dad wrinkle his nose whenever he changed the bandages. The days passed by with what should have been excitement and joy, adventures and exploring, but an undercurrent of unease had settled over everything like a fog. My dad to this day is my favorite adventuring buddy, but even he seemed more cautious now, keeping me closer than usual. He and I climbed mountains and found views of waterfalls, but I kept catching him scanning the tree line with worried eyes. We went hiking and went to group campfires, but I noticed how the other campers would sometimes stop mid-conversation when I passed by, their gazes lingering on me with expressions I couldn't read. At one point I made friends with a girl, close to my age, staying at a cabin nearby with her grandfather, but even she seemed nervous around me, especially after she noticed the smell that had begun following me around, a sour metallic odor that clung to my clothes no matter how often I changed them. On the third to last day of our trip, my dad was exhausted, but he allowed me to explore the remnants of the rock slide behind our cabin. The wound on my leg had started to develop strange dark veins spreading outward from the edges, and walking had become increasingly difficult. But I was desperate to get away from the confines of the cabin, where the walls seemed to press in on me, and every shadow looked like it was moving. I'd gone out there on my own, armed with a pencil and sketch pad, coated thoroughly in bug spray as mosquitoes seem to think I'm an amazing buffet. But as I made my way between the massive boulders, I noticed that the usual forest sounds had died away completely. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, leaving an unnatural stillness that made my ears ring. As I wandered between the boulders and the remnants of a squished cabin, I came across something that made my blood freeze in my veins. There, standing beside a massive round boulder, was a deer, but not like any deer I'd ever seen before. Its hair was a rusty red color that seemed to shift and shimmer in the dappled sunlight, and its limbs looked too long and awkward for its body, as if someone had stretched it on a rack. That boulder stood at around 10 feet in height, and the deer beside it stood at about 8 feet, impossibly tall for any normal animal. I will note here I've always been tall for a girl. Today, as an adult, I stand at 6'2", and back then I would have been around 5'3", so I had a good sense of perspective. This thing towered over me in a way that defied nature. But it was the eyes that really got to me. That deer locked eyes with me, and I felt pure dread wash over me like ice water. Something about its gaze felt malevolent, hungry, and utterly wrong. The eyes were too large, too knowing, and they held an intelligence that no animal should possess. They were a sickly green color, like pond scum, and they seemed to glow with their own internal light. There was something up with its eyes that I couldn't really place at the time, though I can only speculate what it was that bothered me in retrospect. You see, I believe those eyes appeared human, not just intelligent, but human in their shape and expression. They held emotions that animals shouldn't be capable of: malice, calculation, and a predatory satisfaction that made my skin crawl. The creature didn't move like a deer either. It stood perfectly still, unnaturally so, as if it were a statue that had suddenly come to life. Its breathing was wrong too deep, too deliberate, and I could see its chest rising and falling in a rhythm that didn't match any living thing I knew. My dad then called from the cabin, his voice carrying across the clearing with unusual urgency, and I looked back toward the sound. When I turned toward the boulder where the deer had been standing, it was no longer there, but the ground where it had stood was scorched, as if something burning hot had been standing there for a long time. The grass was blackened and withered in the exact shape of hoof prints, but these prints were far larger than any deer should make. All that remained was my sense of dread, now amplified to a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. I took off running toward the sound of my dad's voice and the safety of our cabin, but with every step I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows between the rocks. The feeling of being hunted was so intense that I didn't dare look back, even when I heard what sounded like hoofbeats following behind me. Hoofbeats that were too heavy and too slow to belong to any normal animal. That was the last time I saw or felt such strange and alarming and dread-inducing activity for a few years. But it wasn't really gone. It was just waiting, biding its time. And I would learn later that some things, once they've found you, never really let you go. When I was 13, my parents found a dog at the Humane Society in our county. Her name had been Duchess, but I'm pretty sure she hated that name, so we called her Ruby instead. Ruby was eventually trained as my service dog and became my first lifeline in the adult world. She was a magnificent German Shepherd mix with intelligent brown eyes and an uncanny ability to sense things that others couldn't. The year after our family adopted and trained Ruby, we went on a trip to Calaveras Big Tree's giant sequoia forest as a family. Before we got to our camping spot there, my dad wanted to visit Yosemite and show my mom one of the sites we had visited when we stayed there a few years back. The moment we pulled into the parking area, I felt that familiar dread begin to creep up my spine like cold fingers. But this time it was different, stronger, more focused, as if whatever had been waiting for me was pleased to see me return. Ruby seemed to know this immediately, and she became more clingy and protective over me than was typical of her behavior. As she was a large dog and a rather independent breed, this sudden change was both comforting and deeply alarming. When your big, independent dog begins clinging to and protecting your child, you should take notice. Ruby had always been well-trained and obedient, but now she refused to let me out of her sight. She would position herself between me and any open space, her ears constantly swiveling and her nose working overtime as if she were tracking something I couldn't see. Naturally, my parents attributed this behavior to our being in a new and unfamiliar place, while I attributed it to far more disturbing reasons. The wound on my leg, which had finally healed after months of strange complications, began to ache again with a deep throbbing pain that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. We didn't stay at Yosemite long before piling back into the car and making our way to our camping spot at Calaveras to set up camp and begin exploring. But during that brief stop, Ruby had discovered something that made her hackles rise and her lips pull back in a silent snarl. She kept staring at a point in the tree line where I couldn't see anything. But her intense focus and obvious distress made it clear that something was there. Something she didn't like. This camping trip would be memorable for a plethora of reasons, including me almost being kidnapped and being saved by my trusty best friend. Ruby also spent most of the vacation on high alert, her protective instincts in overdrive as she seemed to sense threats that the rest of us couldn't perceive. My dad also managed to wreck 2 doors of his brand new truck on a sequoia sapling, which apparently didn't understand the concept of yielding to a much larger force. I even found a fun junior ranger group to go with in the evening, learning about the park and its natural inhabitants. Though Ruby insisted on coming with me to every single meeting, our first day was intriguing and eventful, with Ruby immediately establishing a perimeter around our campsite as if she were guarding against an invasion. While my parents were addressing the damage to the truck, I saw the most gorgeous orange and yellow bird fly through our campsite, perching on a tree only about 20 feet away. Being a curious and admittedly reckless kid, I tried to get closer and continue to follow this new and exciting creature as it flitted from tree to tree, seemingly playing keep away. Ruby barked sharply when I started to follow the bird, but I ignored her warnings, caught up in the thrill of the chase. Soon the sound of my parents' exasperated voices was lost to the sounds of the woods, the chirping of cicadas, the crunch of needles and branches beneath my tennis shoes. But underneath those normal forest sounds, I began to hear something else, a low humming that seemed to come from the trees themselves, and the occasional crack of a branch that was too loud and too deliberate to be natural. I realized I could no longer hear my parents at some point, and when I did, the temperature seemed to drop by 20 degrees in an instant. The forest around me had taken on an oppressive quality, with shadows that moved independently of the wind, and in silence that felt like a held breath. I began to acknowledge the dread that was setting in, and the panic beginning to rear its ugly and non-productive head in my mind. As I was about to sit down and wait, because what else do you do in a state of overwhelming fear except become paralyzed by it? Ruby came crashing into view like an avenging angel. She was barking frantically and foaming at the mouth as she often did when she ran at an all-out sprint for too long. But there was something different about her urgency this time. Her eyes were wild with panic, and she kept looking back over her shoulder as if something had been chasing her, or chasing both of us. I was so extremely relieved to see Ruby that I threw my arms around her and proceeded to bury my head in her neck while she stoically stood there panting and drooling. Ruby was 6 at the time, and she was a beautiful mix of German Shepherd and something else we'd never been able to identify. She was amazingly fast and loved to run, but when she sprinted you could hardly follow her with your eyes. The telltale sign of her having been sprinting recently was foam coming out of her mouth, rolling off of her tongue in thick white bubbles. But this time the foam had a pinkish tinge to it, as if she'd been running so hard that she'd damaged something inside her mouth, or as if she'd been biting something that bled. When I let go of her, she pushed past me firmly to help me stand up. I placed a hand on her broad shoulder and braced myself while I lifted my body into a standing position. Ruby made a low, warning sound in her throat and turned around to walk me back to our campsite, but she kept looking back the way we'd come, her ears flat against her head and her tail tucked low. We walked in relative quiet, except for the sound of her heavy panting and the strange way the forest seemed to be holding its breath around us. I tried to enjoy the sounds of her breathing and the familiar crunch of our footsteps, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every few steps, Ruby would stop and look back, a low growl rumbling in her chest. When we got back to our site, my parents were still preoccupied with the truck damage, so I poured Ruby a big dish of water, petting her while she sloppily drank. This was another telltale sign of her overexerting herself, but also of extreme stress. As a breed that was typically very composed, Ruby had rarely ever been this agitated or sloppy with her water consumption. The noisiness of her drinking loud, desperate gulps that sent water splashing everywhere caused my parents to stop and notice. My mom gave me and Ruby a quizzical once-over, taking in Ruby's obvious distress and my own pale, shaken appearance, before turning back to my dad and continuing their conversation about the truck repairs. This would not be the last strange happening on our trip, but it would be the first time my parents were forced to acknowledge that something unusual was going on. Later that evening, as we sat around the campfire, Ruby refused to settle down. She kept pacing the perimeter of our campsite, her nose to the ground as if following a scent trail that worried her. Later on in the trip, we went on a scenic tour of where the biggest tree had been felled decades ago. Ruby stayed at the campsite with my mom, which was unusual. Normally she would insist on coming with me everywhere, but something about that particular area seemed to genuinely frighten her, and no amount of coaxing could get her to come along. So it was only me and my dad who made the trek to see the massive stump. I remember looking into a portion of the felled tree that was twice my height, and hollowed out by decades of decay. The hollow was dark and seemed to extend much deeper into the wood than should have been possible. And there, peering out from the shadows and darkness within that hollow, I saw eyes. Not animal eyes. These were unmistakably human in shape and intelligence, but feral and wild in their expression. They were a sickly green color that seemed to glow with their own light, and they watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just stared with a hunger that was almost tangible. I sucked in my breath and shut my eyes tightly. hoping that when I opened them, the vision would be gone. But when I looked again, the eyes were still there, and now I could see the suggestion of a face around them. Gaunt, elongated features that seemed more skull than flesh. A shiver passed up and down my spine, so violent that my teeth chattered despite the warm afternoon air. My dad, doing the most dad-like thing ever, smacked my shoulder lightly and said, "Let's keep moving, kiddo. Your mom's probably missing us." I nodded furiously, unable to find my voice, and we kept moving. But as we walked away, I could feel those eyes following us, tracking our movement with predatory focus. When we got back after the tour, Ruby trotted up to me immediately, sniffing me obsessively from head to toe, as if checking for contamination. Her behavior was so thorough and urgent that it caught my parents' attention. She spent nearly 10 minutes going over every inch of me, paying particular attention to my hands and face, before finally plopping down beside me and cocking her head to one side with an expression of deep concern. That same day, I took Ruby for a short walk a little later on, and we bumped into a park ranger who proceeded to ask why I was out alone with just a dog at such a young age. She wasn't amused by my overly confident answers about Ruby being protection enough for anyone. The ranger walked me back to our campsite, seeming impressed despite herself at my boldness. She invited me to come to the Junior Rangers group each evening for the rest of the week. And naturally, Ruby went with me each time, and it was at this group that I learned the name of the bird I'd seen, the one that had led me into the woods. It was a western tanager, but the ranger mentioned with some confusion that they weren't typically found in this area, and certainly not behaving in the way I described. The remainder of the week went by in a blur of activities and ranger programs, but always with the underlying tension of feeling watched. Ruby stayed at my side for almost every second of the remainder of the trip, her protective instincts in overdrive. Even when we returned home, she remained hyper-vigilant for weeks, as if she expected whatever had been stalking us to follow us back to California. Nothing else significantly disturbing happened for a few more years to come, but the dread never completely left. It settled into the background of my life like a low-grade fever, always present but not always noticeable. My family moved out of California the year I was to turn 17. At 16, I very quickly became a problem child, acting out in ways that worried my parents, and my mom missed her home in the panhandle of Idaho. As we began the 11-day drive from our little town on the coast of California to our new home in Kootenai County, we stopped to reminisce about some of our trips and good memories. My parents tried to take the time to show me that they wanted a brighter future for me, and create a promise of new adventures and new places to explore. At the time, my mind was clouded by teenage angst and grief for what I was leaving behind, because it was all I'd ever known. But underneath those normal adolescent emotions was something deeper and more troubling. A sense that by leaving California, I was somehow walking into a trap that had been set for me years ago. We stopped briefly at Yosemite, and we drove through Calaveras. We stopped nearby in Stockton for a night, which turned into a few nights due to the theft of our catalytic converter, an event that felt less like random crime and more like a deliberate delay, as if something wanted to keep us in that area longer than we'd planned. During our time reminiscing, I became overshadowed with dread on top of the existing angst and grief. These emotions stayed tangled inside of me for months, maybe even years after moving. The darkness and dread would be present in me throughout many events of trauma and suffering that followed our relocation. It would be so loud and overbearing that it would drown out logic and reason, and my ability to recover from the various traumatic events that seemed to follow me like a curse. The noise and intensity of these raw emotions drowned out my ability to function normally, following a series of traumatic assaults when I was 19, and the severe bullying I was subjected to at 20. The dread overrode my ability to seek help when my first real friend betrayed me in the worst possible way, and when a classmate began to obsess and stalk me at 21. But this underlying dread was more urgent and consuming than any human-inflicted fear or trauma, making it impossible to process and heal from other injuries. I mean, you have to feel things to heal from them, and the constant state of hypervigilance made genuine emotional processing nearly impossible. Ruby aged during these years, becoming less physically capable, but somehow more attuned to the supernatural elements that seemed to surround me. Her hearing and sight began to fail, but her ability to sense otherworldly presences only seemed to strengthen. She would often stare at empty corners or doorways, her hackles rising as she tracked something invisible to human eyes. In her final years, Ruby became almost prophetic in her behavior, She would refuse to let me go certain places, or would insist on accompanying me to others. And inevitably, the places she warned me away from would later become sites of accident or misfortune for other people. It was as if she could sense the presence of whatever was following me and predict where it would strike next. When Ruby finally passed away at the age of 14, I felt more vulnerable and exposed than I ever had in my life. She had been my early warning system, my protection, and my comfort for so many years that her absence left me feeling naked and defenseless against forces I couldn't see or understand. A year or so ago, sometime after the start of the COVID pandemic, I took a job at a large chain company-run elderly care facility. I intentionally chose the knock shift to avoid unnecessary drama and interaction with other people, but also because something in me was drawn to the darkness and isolation, almost as if I were being guided toward situations where I would be most vulnerable. I worked with one other person during the shift, and that would either be my coworker Stella or Morgan. On most nights I worked with coworker Stella. She was older and not nearly as green as most of the other employees of the facility, with years of experience dealing with both the living and what she euphemistically called the not-so-departed. She trained me, and had my back as much as possible during my short time there, but even her experience couldn't prepare either of us for what we encountered. Within the first week of my being on Nook shift with Stella, we endured quite a bit of supernatural activity that left both of us questioning our sanity and our career choices. Doors would fly open at us and slam shut with tremendous force, usually targeting me specifically. The sound would echo through the halls like gunshots, waking residents and sending them into panic. Footsteps would pace up and down the halls with deliberate heavy treads that suggested someone much larger and heavier than any of our residents. We would hear running noises in one of the stairwells. Not the light pattering of someone hurrying, but the thunderous pounding of something huge moving at inhuman speed. The sounds would start at the top floor and race down to the basement, then back up again, over and over until dawn. Crawling or scuttling sounds would come from the vents above our heads, as if something large was moving through the ductwork, but when maintenance checked the next day, they would find the vents undisturbed and much too small for anything human-sized to navigate. At one point, I got locked in one of the laundry rooms while the room was running at about 90 degrees. The door handle wouldn't turn no matter how hard I tried, and the temperature seemed to keep climbing despite the fact that no machines were running. I pounded on the door and shouted for help, but somehow Stella couldn't hear me even though she was just down the hall. When the door finally opened on its own, without anyone touching it, I stumbled out drenched in sweat and gasping for air. The temperature in the hallway felt shockingly cold by comparison, and Stella looked at me with genuine fear when she saw the state I was in. Stella had started hearing voices sometimes, behind doors that had just opened or shut, or around corners when she could hear the pacing footsteps. She swore up and down that it had to be me, as it sounded exactly like my voice, but I was rarely ever near the area at the time she heard it. The voices would call her name in my tone and inflection, asking her to come help with something or to bring supplies to a particular room, but when she would go to investigate, she would find the rooms empty and me working in a completely different part of the building. One time I came out of the stairwell right after she'd heard my voice coming from a residence room, so it couldn't possibly have been me. Stella was furious that someone or something was harassing us at work, using my voice to lure her into potentially dangerous situations. The most disturbing incident involved one of our residents, an elderly man who had been catatonic for months. During one of my shifts, I found him sitting up in bed, staring directly at me with eyes that seemed far too aware and alert for his condition. When I approached to check on him, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "It's been waiting for you to come back." His voice was hoarse from disuse, but the words were clear and deliberate. "It followed you here, and now it's going to finish what it started." Before I could respond or call for help, he had laid back down and returned to his catatonic state, as if nothing had happened. But the bruises on my wrist from his grip lasted for weeks, and he died peacefully in his sleep 3 days later. I took a night off to see my then significant other at the time, and when I came back, Stella asked me if the building felt different. For the first time in months, I could acknowledge that I felt no dread somewhere. I felt safe and protected within those walls. But this safety would be extremely short-lived as I moved to a new facility and trouble would follow me there soon after. My first marriage came and went, ending with domestic violence that seemed to escalate whenever the supernatural activity around me intensified, as if the entity that followed me fed off human suffering and conflict. During the first 2 weeks of my first marriage, abuse began to manifest in ways that seemed designed to isolate me and make me more vulnerable to other forms of attack. On weekends, we would go to bonfires out in Hayden Creek, and it was on one of these nights when my husband first put his hands on me in violence. That same night, we saw what I believe was the same entity from every other incident, but now it had taken on the appearance of an enormous elk. We were all piled in my brother-in-law's truck, bumping down a dirt back road, when 2 elk took off across the road in front of us. The second of the 2 elk stopped and locked eyes with us directly through the windshield. It had an unnatural reddish hue to its hair, and its legs looked abhorrently long and twisted, as if they had been broken and healed incorrectly multiple times. Its antlers were massive beyond any natural proportions, extending so wide that they seemed to scrape the low-hanging branches on either side of the road. Seconds ticked by as we sat frozen in the truck, unable to look away from its hypnotic green eyes. Finally, it turned and took off up the hillside with movements that were too fluid and graceful for something so large, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. Only 2 short months after this sighting, my first marriage would end in violence and restraining orders. I took a job at another large corporation-run elderly care facility, where I underwent being bullied, discriminated against, and severely overworked for more than half a year. I loathed being in that building alone at night, and often worked obsessively, cleaning the place from top to bottom to avoid paying any attention to the dread or terror that would set in after dark. The activity there was more aggressive than anything I'd experienced before, with objects being thrown at me and doors slamming so hard that they would crack their frames. I was often in this facility for 16-hour shifts on my own, and this went on for months with only 1 or 2 days off in total. The isolation and exhaustion made me more susceptible to whatever was stalking me, and the incidents escalated to physical attacks that left marks on my body. I left this facility to go to a smaller one nearby during my second marriage. My second marriage would end in emotional abuse and gaslighting around addiction issues. The divorce is still being processed as I'm typing this out, and I'm still working at this smaller facility.
Cafe, as I've come to call the entity, seems to enjoy it here, and the torment has really begun to intensify. I work the no-see shift here, which runs from 10:30 p.m. to 7 a.m. Our facility operates on a rotation of 4 days on and 2 days off, but I pick up shifts to work every day with only 1 day off every few weeks.
Sometimes I come in early, or work the occasional double shift. The house I work in has a minimum of 2 staff at all times, even at night, which provides a mild comfort. I also find comfort in my service dog in training refusing to leave my side during the shift. My service dog in training is still very young, but does a fantastic job as my medical alert and has come a very long way in a short time regarding behavior and advanced task training. My service dog in training is a 7-month-old German Shepherd named Scout, and she's remarkable in her ability to sense supernatural presences. I want to unequivocally state that Scout doesn't have a mean bone in her body under normal circumstances. Until these recent incidents, I'd never seen any sign of protection or aggression come out of my young companion. She's actually trained against aggressive behavior, as most service animals are. Within my first week at the facility, I learned that the lights need to stay on at night throughout the building. When they don't, doors open and shut in the darkness with violent force, and we can hear pacing and running up and down the halls that sounds like someone wearing heavy boots. Today, the only lights that get turned off are in the activity room and the TV rooms, and the door to the activity room gets pulled shut and locked. During my second week at this facility, another staff member mentioned feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were being stalked by something that wanted to hurt them when the lights were off in the building. The elevator is often heard going to the basement and opening with mechanical precision before coming back up to the main and second stories and opening again. This happens when no one is operating it, with the exception of it happening one time when I happened to be on it myself. I'd gotten on the elevator at the start of my third week, and the button on the keypad which unlocks the elevator's ability to go to the basement suddenly illuminated green without anyone touching it. The door shut with a definitive clang, and before I knew it, they were opening to reveal the complete darkness of the facility basement. I stifled a scream with my hand, and Scout started to bark and growl with an intensity I'd never heard from her before. Her hackles were raised so high that she looked twice her normal size, and she was backing toward me as if trying to shield me from something in the darkness. I hit the second story button with desperate speed over and over until the doors finally began to shut. But just as they were closing, I saw the last thing I wanted to see, those familiar green eyes looking at me from the shadows, and this time I could make out more of the figure they belonged to. It was tall, easily 7 feet, and covered in that same rusty red hair I'd seen years ago on the deer in Yosemite, but now it was standing upright on 2 legs that bent backward like an animal's, ending in hoofed feet that were partially hidden in the darkness. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands that were tipped with long curved claws that gleamed in the elevator light. A few nights later, a coworker of mine, Patricia, took it upon herself to perform a cleansing ritual on the building. This seemed to absolutely enrage Haifa in a way that I'd never experienced before. Another of my coworker, Anne, felt a burning pain during the cleansing, and when we walked past the upstairs television room, she lifted her shirt to reveal ugly red lines that looked as if someone had tried to claw at her through her uniform. The marks were deep enough to draw blood, and were arranged in a pattern that suggested 4 parallel claws had raked across her back. Anne was terrified, of course, and refused to go anywhere upstairs by herself from then on. An hour after the incident, the protection charm I wore around my neck was violently ripped off while I was pulling the door to the activities room shut. The chain snapped with a sharp crack, and the charm was hurled over the second-story balcony with such force that it shattered when it hit the floor below. I was left with a red line on the left side of my neck that looked like a rope burn and lasted for nearly a week. For a few days after the cleansing, it seemed relatively calm, but the heavy dread still hung in the air like a toxic fog. My 5th week started with a literal bang, a tremendous crash while the lights were off that shook the entire building and set off several car alarms in the parking lot. When that happened, the door to the activities room slammed shut so hard that it cracked the door frame, and the attic entrance in that room opened up on its own. After hearing the massive crash of the ladder sliding down and hitting the floor, I heard running in the attic above heavy, deliberate footsteps that moved back and forth as if something was pacing. Then I heard what sounded eerily similar to my coworker Patricia's voice coming from the entrance to the attic, saying in a monotonous, robotic tone, "You have to see this. You have to come up here." I knew it couldn't possibly be Patricia. She had driven home over an hour ago, and the facility doors are locked after 11 p.m., meaning she would have had to call me to get back in. Besides, the inflection and tone were all wrong. The voice sounded flat and emotionless, very unlike Patricia's naturally bubbly and expressive way of speaking. I shuddered as I pushed the door open, holding on to my replacement protection charm with my left hand while I groped for the switch to the activity room light with my right hand. I found the light and flicked it on to reveal the ladder down and the attic opening like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. Just as I had heard, this sight came with the sound of my then-husband's voice calling from the darkness above. "Babe, come here, I want to show you something." I knew this was not my husband, as he was at home asleep and his voice sounded wrong, like he'd been talking through a radio with a dying battery. It sounded broken and distorted, as if someone was trying to mimic his voice but didn't quite understand human speech patterns. I stepped forward to push the ladder up, and in the darkness above I saw 2 green eyes, and a slight sheen of red surrounding them in the shape of an inhumanly tall figure. Claws became visible as a hand reached down and grasped the edge of the opening to the attic. The hand was enormous, easily twice the size of a human hand, and the claws extended several inches beyond the fingertips. The skin looked leathery and dark, covered in that same rusty red hair, and I could see veins pulsing beneath the surface, as if whatever this thing was had a circulatory system that worked differently from anything natural. I backed away from there at a speed that should have been impossible, only to realize that Scout was standing at the base of the ladder with her hackles raised, growling like a rabid beast ready to attack. Her lips were pulled back to reveal all of her teeth, and she was making sounds I'd never heard from any dog before, low guttural noises that seemed to come from somewhere primal and ancient. As I grasped Scout's collar and pulled her back, I pushed up the ladder with as much force as I could muster and hooked the back of the attic drop-down hatch with my right foot before kicking it up to my hand and slamming that thing shut with a bang that rattled windows throughout the building. Following this confrontation, I received about 12 calls from residents who were concerned that the building was going to collapse. My partner that night, Kim, managed to sleep through the entire ordeal, somehow remaining unconscious despite the tremendous noise. To this day, she can sleep through almost anything, and despite it being a breach of policy, often does just that during our shifts. I'm currently on my 18th week at this facility. The attic has opened 3 more times since then, and I've suffered several unexplained attacks that have left me with cuts on my hands and red marks on my ankles and wrists that look like finger bruises. In the most recent attack, I was grabbed by the ankles and dragged backwards into the dark activities room, after hearing the door swing open while I was waiting for the elevator. The grip was impossibly strong, and I could feel claws digging into my skin through my shoes. Naturally, Scout turned into a snarling, snapping guardian, and I managed to crawl away and call her to me before whatever had grabbed me could drag me further into the darkness. I opted to take the stairs for the rest of the night, and I've been doing so ever since. 2 nights before Thanksgiving, Patricia worked a double shift, putting her on Nuck as my partner. I'm focused on cleaning and resident care instead of sitting and scrolling through my phone or wasting time on the company computer. We'd been upstairs polishing the resident display cases and wiping down all the baseboards when I stopped in front of the activities room door. The lights were off and the door was locked this time, but through the glass I got a clear, unmistakable look at Hefa in his full manifestation. He was standing there looking down at me from his towering height of nearly 8 feet, covered in rusty red hair that seemed to move and shift even though there was no wind. The arms were freakishly long, ending in hands that ended in claws that just barely dragged on the ugly brown carpet. The legs were bent backward like Scout's back legs, but much more pronounced, ending in hoofed feet that were partially embedded in the floor as if his weight was too much for the building to support. I looked up from his clawed feet to see his head framed with horns similar to those of a ram's, but much larger and twisted, in a sickening shade of dark red that looked like dried blood. His green eyes were fixed on me with an expression of pure hatred and hunger that made my soul recoil. Drool began to lazily drip from the foaming mass of his mouth, falling to the floor with audible splashes that seemed much too loud for simple saliva. With a thud that shook the glass of the door and caught Patricia's attention, he dropped onto all fours, opening his mouth to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth that belonged to no earthly creature. A long serpentine tongue unfurled from the masses of drool and teeth, extending nearly to the floor. He pressed his face against the glass and licked the door where my face was, leaving trails of condensation from his breath and saliva that steamed against the cold surface. Scout, already bristling with tension, began to let out the most hateful and guttural growls I'd ever heard from any animal. I picked her up, all 60 pounds of her, and proceeded to walk away from that room as quickly as possible without running. I told Patricia we would not be going near the activities room until dawn broke, or hell froze over. She nodded and grabbed the rest of our cleaning supplies to move on to the next wing, but not before taking one look back at the door. The look on her face told me she had seen something too, though she never spoke about it. Since this incident, I've had 2 days off due to being violently ill with symptoms that no doctor could explain or treat. I still managed to work a double on Thanksgiving, which was surprisingly uneventful, and gave me hope that maybe the worst was over. But I know better now. Hafey follows me, and I don't think he will stop until I'm dead and gone. He's my own personal demon, and I still don't know what variety he is or what he ultimately wants from me. Anne and Patricia both believe he's something that has been hunting me since I was a child, possibly drawn by some quality I possess that I'm not aware of. If that's true, how do I get rid of him? And why would he follow me all this time? I'm just me, a collection of trauma, determination, and misplaced care for other people. But apparently that's enough to sustain whatever this thing is, and I'm running out of places to hide from something that seems to grow stronger every year. The only thing I know for certain is that this won't end until one of us is gone, and I'm not sure I'm strong enough to be the one left standing. But I have to try, because the alternative is too terrible to consider, and there are people I care about who could become collateral damage in this war I never asked to fight. God help me. I don't know how much longer I can keep running from something that knows exactly where I am at all times, but I'll keep fighting until I can't anymore, because that's all I know how to do. The year 2020 had been nothing short of a nightmare for all of us. The global pandemic had stolen our senior year, our graduation ceremony, and any semblance of normalcy we had clung to. As October drew to a close, I found myself staring at my laptop screen, watching my classmates' faces flicker in and out of pixelated video calls that had replaced our final months of high school. The empty hallways of our school haunted my dreams, and the silence where laughter should have been felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I remember sitting in my bedroom, the autumn wind rattling my windows, when the idea struck me. Halloween was approaching. October 31st fell on a Saturday, and there would be a blue moon hanging in the sky. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to reclaim something, anything from the year that had been ripped away from us. We needed to gather, to feel human again, to remember what it was like to be young and reckless before the world had taught us to fear everything. The thought of hosting a party at my own house made my stomach turn. The last time we tried that, months before the world shut down, we discovered missing electronics, broken furniture, and a lingering stench of destruction that took weeks to eliminate. My parents had barely forgiven me then, and I knew they wouldn't tolerate another disaster. I opened Discord and started typing messages to my closest friends. The familiar ping of notifications filled my room as responses began flooding in. Maya Brelsebrain for welcome for Meissen to Prostrings bitches the Jessica, Maya's best friend, chimed in with characteristic enthusiasm, suggesting we find somewhere remote where we could make as much noise as we wanted without worrying about neighbors or police. That's when Tyler, never one to shy away from adventure, suggested something that made my blood freeze in my veins. "What about that cabin your cousin owns?" he typed. "The one way out in the woods? Perfect for Halloween, don't you think?" The cabin. I hadn't thought about that place in months, but suddenly every terrifying memory came rushing back. My third cousin Trevor had inherited the property from his grandfather, a sprawling wooden structure nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. Trevor had moved to California earlier that year for a teaching position, leaving the cabin in the care of his husband Michael. I stared at Tyler's message for several minutes, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The rational part of my brain screamed warnings about isolated locations and the things that lurked in dark forests. But the desperate teenager in me, starved for connection and normalcy, began typing before I could stop myself. "I'll ask if we can use it," I wrote, my heart already racing with anticipation and dread. Michael's response came faster than I expected. "Sure, kids. Just promise me no alcohol." I laughed darkly at my screen, knowing full well that promises made in desperation are rarely kept. October 31st, 2020. The date burned itself into my memory as I loaded my car with supplies, my hands shaking slightly as I arranged bags of chips, bottles of soda, and the bottle of whiskey I'd managed to acquire despite Michael's explicit instructions. The drive to the cabin wound through increasingly dense forest, the trees pressing closer to the road with each mile until they formed a canopy so thick that even the afternoon sun struggled to penetrate. My plague doctor costume sat in the passenger seat, the long black robe and leather mask seeming oddly appropriate for a year that had been defined by disease and death. The beak-like protrusion designed to hold herbs and protective materials felt like a cruel joke, as if any of us could truly protect ourselves from the horrors that 2020 had unleashed. The cabin emerged from the forest like something from a nightmare. Its wooden walls had darkened with age and weather, and several windows were boarded up, giving the structure an abandoned, wounded appearance. The wraparound porch sagged in places, and I could see gaps between the floorboards that suggested years of neglect. Despite Trevor's assurances that the place was habitable, it looked like it hadn't seen human presence in decades. I parked in the gravel clearing that served as a driveway, noting how the sound of my engine died into absolute silence the moment I turned it off. The quiet was oppressive, unnatural. No birds sang in the trees, no insects buzzed in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold itself in check, as if afraid to disturb whatever dwelt in these woods. Inside, the cabin was marginally better than its exterior suggested. The furniture was old but solid, covered in dust sheets that I pulled away to reveal worn leather chairs and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The kitchen was functional, if dated, and I managed to get the electricity working after several attempts with the breaker box. But despite my efforts to make the place welcoming, an atmosphere of unease permeated every room. I changed into my costume in the master bedroom, pulling the heavy fabric over my clothes and adjusting the mask until I could see clearly through its dark eye holes. In the cracked mirror above the dresser, I looked like death itself, a fitting avatar for what had been a year of mourning and loss. Tyler arrived first, his car's headlights sweeping across the cabin's facade like searchlights hunting for hidden threats. His costume, a glowing purge mask that cast eerie shadows across his face, made him look like something from our darkest collective nightmares. He carried a case of hard cider, the bottles clinking together with each step. "This place is perfect," he said, but his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "Really captures the whole apocalyptic vibe of this year." Maya appeared next, her red hooded cape fluttering behind her as she hurried from her car to the porch. Her little Red Riding Hood costume should have looked innocent, childlike even, but something about the way the shadows fell across her face made her appear hunted, desperate. She clutched a basket filled with snacks and decorations, her knuckles white with tension. "I don't like how quiet it is out here," she whispered as she entered the cabin, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "It feels like something's watching us." Jessica bounded through the door with characteristic energy, her anime catgirl costume complete with ears and tail. But even her usual enthusiasm seemed forced, brittle. She kept looking toward the windows, her movements quick and jerky, like prey sensing a predator nearby. Finally, Brandon arrived dressed as a military figure from some video game, complete with combat boots and tactical vest. He carried a duffel bag that clinked with each step, and when I asked what was inside, he just grinned and said, "Insurance policy. You never know what kind of wildlife is out here." We threw ourselves into the celebration with desperate intensity, as if we could drink and laugh our way out of the fear that seemed to seep from the cabin's walls. The whiskey burned going down, but it helped numb the edge of anxiety that had been building since my arrival. We played card games and video games, told stories about our ruined senior year, and complained about online classes and social distancing. But underneath the forced merriment, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. Every creak of the old wooden structure made us pause mid-conversation. Every gust of wind that rattled the windows sent nervous glances around the room. We were trying too hard to have fun, and we all knew it. As darkness fell outside, we decided to watch horror movies, a tradition that seemed especially appropriate given our circumstances. Tyler had brought a collection of psychological thrillers, the kind that relied more on tension and atmosphere than gore and special effects. But even as we settled into the worn leather furniture, bowls of popcorn balanced on our laps, none of us could shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The first movie played without incident, though I noticed that we all kept glancing toward the windows, expecting to see faces pressed against the glass or shadows moving between the trees. During the second film, a story about people trapped in an isolated location while something hunted them from outside. Maya grabbed my arm so tightly that her fingernails left marks. "This is too real," she whispered, her breath hot against my ear. Being stuck out here cut off from help. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that we were safe, but the words stuck in my throat. Because deep down, in the part of my mind that still remembered childhood fears and primitive instincts, I knew she was right to be afraid. As the night wore on, our conversation grew increasingly morbid. We talked about the people we'd lost during the pandemic, not just to the virus, but to suicide, overdoses, and the crushing weight of isolation. We discussed the riots and protests, the way our country seemed to be tearing itself apart at the seams. We wondered aloud if we'd ever feel safe again, if the world would ever return to anything resembling normal. "Sometimes I think we're all just pretending," Jessica said during a lull in conversation, her cat ears drooping as she stared into her empty cup. "Pretending that things will get better, that we'll go to college, get jobs, have normal lives. But what if this is it? What if this is all we get?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, acrid and choking. None of us had an answer, because none of us really believed that our futures were guaranteed anymore. The pandemic had taught us that everything could change in an instant, that safety was an illusion and security was a luxury we could no longer afford. It was Jessica who first suggested going outside. She'd had more to drink than the rest of us, and the alcohol had made her reckless, eager to chase away her fears through action rather than introspection. "Let's go explore the woods," she said, stumbling slightly as she stood up. "Come on, it's Halloween night, there's a blue moon, and we're in the perfect creepy location. When will we ever get another chance like this?" I felt my heart rate spike at the suggestion. The forest had been ominous enough in daylight. The thought of venturing into it after dark filled me with a primal terror that I couldn't rationalize away. "That's a terrible idea," I said, trying to keep my voice light despite the panic rising in my throat. "You want to wander around in the dark woods drunk in costumes that make it hard to see or move? What could possibly go wrong?" But Jessica was already moving toward the door, swaying slightly on her feet. "You're all being paranoid," she called over her shoulder. "It's just trees and animals. What's the worst that could happen?" I wanted to grab her, to force her to sit back down and think rationally about what she was proposing. But before I could react, She had yanked open the front door and disappeared into the night, leaving only the sound of her laughter echoing through the trees. The silence that followed Jessica's departure was deafening. We stared at the open doorway, watching the darkness beyond swallow up any trace of our friend. The blue moon hung overhead like a malevolent eye, casting everything in stark, unforgiving light that created more shadows than it illuminated. "We have to go after her," Maya said, already reaching for her jacket. "She's drunk, she's in a stupid costume, and she has no idea what's out there. God knows what could happen to her." Tyler nodded reluctantly, his glowing mask making him look like some kind of electronic specter. "She could get lost, fall into a ravine, get attacked by a bear. We can't just leave her out there." Brandon, however, shook his head vehemently. "Are you insane? This is exactly how people die in horror movies. The smart ones stay inside where it's safe, and the idiots go chasing after their friends into the darkness. Count me out." I understood his logic, but I also knew he was wrong about one crucial thing. There was no safety here, not really. The cabin felt exposed, vulnerable, its thin walls offering nothing more than the illusion of protection. At least if we went looking for Jessica, we'd be taking action instead of waiting helplessly for whatever was lurking in the darkness to come to us. "Fine," I said, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. "Brandon, you stay here in case Jessica comes back. The rest of us will do a quick sweep of the immediate area. 15 minutes, no more, then we come back whether we find her or not." We armed ourselves with flashlights and cell phones, though the latter showed no signal bars this deep in the forest. Tyler found a heavy walking stick from the porch, while Maya grabbed a kitchen knife, not much against a bear or wolf, but better than nothing. I checked my phone's GPS, making note of our location so we could find our way back if necessary. The moment we stepped outside, the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. Our breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and the grass crunched under our feet with frost that hadn't been there when we'd arrived. The blue moon provided enough light to see by, but it also created a landscape of harsh contrasts, brilliant white clearings surrounded by pools of absolute blackness where the trees grew thick. "Jessica," Maya called out, her voice swallowed immediately by the forest. "Jessica, where are you?" No response came back, not even an echo. It was as if the woods had absorbed her voice completely, leaving nothing but oppressive silence. We started walking along the dirt road that led away from the cabin, our flashlight beams sweeping back and forth across the tree line. Every shadow could hide a threat, every rustling branch could signal danger. The Halloween costumes that had seemed fun inside now felt like cruel jokes. The plague doctor's robe caught on every branch. Tyler's mask limited his peripheral vision, and Maya's cape kept getting tangled around her legs. After about 5 minutes of walking, I stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" The others paused, straining their ears against the silence. For a moment there was nothing. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of branches snapping somewhere off to our right. "Jessica," Tyler called out, turning his flashlight toward the sound. Another snap, this one closer. Then another. Whatever was moving through the underbrush was large, heavy enough to break substantial branches as it moved, and it was heading in our direction. "That doesn't sound human," Maya whispered, pressing close against my side. "Humans don't move like that." She was right. The sounds were rhythmic but wrong somehow, as if whatever was making them moved on 4 legs rather than 2. Each footfall was followed by a pause, as if the creature was stopping to listen, to track our location by sound and scent. I raised my flashlight and swept it in a wide arc toward the source of the noise. The beam penetrated perhaps 20 feet into the forest before being swallowed by darkness. But in that brief illumination, I thought I saw something that made my heart stop. Eyes. 2 points of light reflecting back at us from the darkness, too high off the ground to belong to any normal forest animal. They watched us for perhaps 3 seconds before disappearing, but those seconds stretched into eternity. "We need to get back to the cabin," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Right now." But even as I spoke, the sounds of movement began again, this time from multiple directions. Whatever was out there, it wasn't alone. We were surrounded. Panic struck us like lightning. Without discussion or coordination, we turned and ran back toward the cabin, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we stumbled over roots and rocks in the darkness. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and underneath it all, a low growling that seemed to come from multiple throats. Maya's cape caught on a low branch, jerking her backward. She cried out in terror as she fought to free herself, her flashlight spinning away into the darkness. Tyler grabbed her arm and yanked her forward, the fabric tearing away in long strips. "Don't stop," I shouted, though I could barely hear my own voice over the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. "Whatever you do, don't stop running." My plague doctor costume was a nightmare to run in. The long robe twisted around my legs with every step, and the mask made it impossible to see clearly in my peripheral vision. But terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed, and I somehow managed to keep pace with the others despite the cumbersome outfit. The cabin's lights appeared through the trees like a beacon of salvation, but they seemed impossibly far away. With each step, I expected to feel claws rake across my back or teeth sink into my neck. The sounds behind us were getting closer, and I could swear I heard heavy breathing that didn't belong to any of us. Tyler stumbled and went down hard, his glowing mask skittering across the ground and going dark. Maya and I each grabbed one of his arms and hauled him back to his feet, never breaking stride. His knee was bleeding through his torn jeans, but he managed to keep running. 20 yards from the cabin. 15. 10. The front door stood open, just as Jessica had left it, spilling warm yellow light onto the porch. Brandon appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and fear. "What's happening?" he shouted. "Where's Jessica?" We burst through the doorway and immediately slammed it shut behind us, throwing the deadbolt and pushing one of the heavy chairs against it for good measure. All three of us collapsed against the door, gasping for breath and shaking with adrenaline. "Something's out there," Maya managed between gulps of air. "Multiple somethings. They were hunting us." Brandon stared at us like we'd lost our minds. "Hunting you? What are you talking about? What kind of animals?" I shook my head, still trying to process what we'd experienced. "I don't know. They moved wrong, sounded wrong. The eyes..." I shuddered, remembering those twin points of light watching us from the darkness. "Where's Jessica?" Tyler asked, wiping blood from his scraped knee. "Please tell me she came back while we were gone." Brandon's expression grew grim. "No sign of her. I was hoping you'd found her and she was with you." The implication hung heavy in the air. Jessica was still out there, alone in the darkness with whatever had been stalking us. The thought made me physically sick. "We have to call for help," Maya said, pulling out her phone. "Police, park rangers, somebody." But her phone showed the same thing mine did. No signal. We were cut off from the outside world, isolated in this remote location with no way to communicate with anyone who could help. "What about a landline?" I asked Brandon. "Did you see a phone anywhere?" He shook his head. "Nothing. This place is completely off the grid." We spent the next few minutes checking every room, every closet, desperately searching for some means of communication. But the cabin offered nothing. No phone, no internet, no radio. We were truly alone. As we regrouped in the main room, a new sound reached our ears. Scratching. Something was moving around outside the cabin, testing the walls, probing for weaknesses. We heard it circle the building once, twice, the sounds growing more aggressive with each pass. "The windows," Maya whispered. "Are they all locked?" We split up to check, and what we found made our blood freeze. 3 of the windows on the cabin's east side had been forced open from outside, their locks broken or jimmied loose. Fresh scratches marked the wooden sills, as if something with claws had been trying to gain entry. But that wasn't the worst discovery. In the master bedroom, Tyler found Jessica's discarded cat ears and tail lying on the floor beneath an open window. They were torn and bloody. The sight of Jessica's costume pieces, stained with what could only be blood, transformed our fear into something far more primal and desperate. Maya began sobbing uncontrollably, while Tyler sank into one of the armchairs and put his head in his hands. Even Brandon, who had been skeptical of our story, now looked pale and shaken. "We need weapons," I said, forcing myself to think rationally despite the panic clawing at my insides. "Whatever took Jessica, it's coming back for us." Brandon nodded and unzipped his duffel bag, revealing not just the hunting rifle I'd glimpsed earlier, but also a box of ammunition, a tactical knife, and a can of bear spray. "I brought these for target practice and wildlife protection," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Guess I was more right than I knew. We barricaded the broken windows with furniture, stacking chairs and tables against the openings until they were completely blocked. The main door got similar treatment, a heavy bookshelf dragged across it, supplemented by everything else we could move. By the time we finished, the cabin felt like a fortress, but also like a tomb. The scratching sounds continued throughout our fortification efforts, growing more aggressive and coordinated. Whatever was outside had definitely multiplied. We could hear movement from at least 3 different directions, as if we were being systematically surrounded. "It's like they're intelligent," Tyler observed, peering through a gap in our makeshift barricades. "They're not just attacking randomly, they're planning something." As if to confirm his words, the sound suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been, heavy with menace and anticipation. We huddled together in the center of the main room, weapons within easy reach, waiting for whatever would come next. Minutes passed like hours. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to embers, casting dancing shadows on the walls that made every corner seem to harbor threats. Our flashlights created pools of light that only seemed to make the darkness beyond more impenetrable. Then Maya screamed. She was pointing toward one of the windows we hadn't blocked, one that faced the back of the cabin. Pressed against the glass was a human face, but wrong in every conceivable way. The features were distorted, elongated, covered in what looked like mud or dried blood. The eyes were too large, reflecting light like an animal's, and the mouth hung open to reveal teeth that seemed too sharp and too numerous. The face stayed pressed against the window for perhaps 5 seconds before disappearing, but the image burned itself into our retinas. None of us spoke for several moments, all of us hoping against hope that we had somehow shared the same hallucination. "That was Jessica," Maya finally whispered. "That was Jessica, but wrong. Something happened to her out there." I wanted to deny it, to insist that Jessica was simply injured and in shock, that the darkness and our own fear had distorted what we'd seen. But the rational part of my mind couldn't explain away those eyes, those teeth, the way she'd moved. The attack came without warning. The front door, despite all our barricades, suddenly exploded inward with tremendous force. Wood splintered and furniture scattered as something massive forced its way through our defenses. In the chaos and darkness, I caught glimpses of movement, something large and low to the ground, moving with inhuman speed and agility. Brandon had the rifle in his hands and was trying to get a clear shot, but our attacker moved too fast, staying in the shadows at the edges of our vision. Tyler swung his flashlight like a club, the beam spinning wildly as he fought something we couldn't see clearly. Maya grabbed the kitchen knife and positioned herself back to back with me as we tried to cover all angles. The bear spray hissed as Brandon deployed it blindly into the darkness, filling the air with a chemical fog that made our eyes water and our throats burn. Through the chaos, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. Laughter. Human laughter, but distorted, stretched as if the vocal cords producing it had been damaged or changed. It was coming from multiple directions now, surrounding us. "The bedroom," Tyler shouted. "There's another one in the bedroom." I spun toward the hallway and saw a shadow detach itself from the walls, moving with fluid, predatory grace. It was humanoid in shape but wrong in its proportions, too tall, too thin, joints bending in ways that human anatomy shouldn't allow. Brandon fired the rifle, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The shadow jerked and stumbled, but didn't fall, instead retreating back into the darkness with a sound that was part scream and part howl. "We can't stay here," I shouted over the ringing in our ears. "There are too many of them, and they know the layout better than we do." But even as I spoke, I realized we had nowhere to go. The forest outside was their domain, and they had already demonstrated their ability to get inside the cabin at will. We were trapped, surrounded by creatures that had once been human but were human no longer. The laughter continued, echoing through the cabin from hidden corners and shadowy recesses. It seemed to be getting closer, multiplying, as if more and more of them were gathering for some final coordinated assault. What happened next defied every rational explanation I possessed, but I swear by all that's holy that every word is true. The temperature in the cabin began to drop rapidly, our breath forming clouds in air that had been comfortable moments before. Frost began forming on the interior windows, and I could see ice crystals growing on the metal fixtures. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made my soul recoil. Whispers. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all speaking in unison but just below the threshold of comprehension. The words seemed to come from the walls themselves, surrounding us with their unintelligible message. Maya collapsed to her knees, clutching her head and moaning. "Make it stop," she begged. "Please, God, make it stop." Tyler and Brandon were similarly affected, their faces twisted in pain as the whispers grew louder and more insistent. I felt my own sanity beginning to fray at the edges as the voices wormed their way into my consciousness, carrying with them images and sensations that no human mind was meant to process. Through the torment, I managed to focus on the main door. The barricade we'd built was being systematically dismantled from the outside, furniture moving aside with deliberate precision. Whatever intelligence was directing this assault, it was far beyond anything we'd initially imagined. As the last chair was pushed away, the door swung open to reveal a sight that nearly shattered what remained of my rational mind. Jessica stood in the doorway, but the creature wearing her face bore only a superficial resemblance to our friend. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and dark veins were visible beneath its surface. Her eyes were completely black, reflecting no light whatsoever. Her mouth hung open slightly, revealing teeth that had grown longer and more pointed. But most disturbing of all were the others behind her. I counted at least 6 figures in the darkness beyond the door, all of them sharing Jessica's altered appearance. They moved with perfect synchronization, as if controlled by a single will. "Hello," Jessica said, her voice carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. "We've been waiting for you to join us. It's so much better out here. No more fear, no more pain, no more uncertainty about the future." Maya tried to back away, but Tyler and Brandon seemed frozen in place, their eyes locked on Jessica's face with a mixture of horror and fascination. "The world is ending anyway," Jessica continued, taking a step into the cabin. "You've seen the signs, the disease, the violence, the breakdown of everything you once thought was permanent. Why cling to a dying civilization when you could be part of something eternal?" Her words carried a strange compulsion, and I found myself actually considering what she was offering. What if she was right? What if our old lives, our old selves, were just illusions we'd been clinging to out of habit rather than genuine desire? But then Maya screamed, a sound of pure, undiluted terror that cut through Jessica's hypnotic influence like a blade. The spell was broken, and I saw our situation clearly once again. Whatever these things were, whatever they were offering, it wasn't salvation, it was extinction. "Brandon," I shouted, "the rifle!" He shook his head as if waking from a dream, and raised the weapon. But his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't aim properly. Jessica laughed that horrible, distorted sound and began moving toward us with inhuman speed. I grabbed Tyler's flashlight and shone it directly into Jessica's face. She recoiled with a shriek that sounded like metal being torn apart, her altered features becoming even more grotesque in the harsh light. The others in the doorway also fell back, shielding their eyes from the beam. "The light," I yelled. "They don't like bright light." We grabbed every flashlight and phone we had, creating a barrier of illumination between ourselves and the creatures. They retreated to the doorway but didn't leave entirely, testing the edges of our defensive perimeter like predators waiting for an opening. For several minutes we maintained our standoff. They couldn't advance into the light, but we couldn't maintain our battery-powered defense forever. Eventually our lights would fail, and then we would be at their mercy. That's when I heard the sound that would save our lives. The distant crack of a rifle shot echoing through the forest from somewhere far away. The gunshot had an immediate and dramatic effect on our attackers. Jessica and her companions turned toward the sound with expressions of alarm and confusion, their perfect synchronization finally broken. For the first time since this nightmare began, they seemed uncertain, vulnerable. "There are others," one of them hissed. Not Jessica, but another figure whose features I couldn't make out in the darkness. "Others who haven't been changed." Jessica snarled, showing those impossibly sharp teeth. "Find them. Convert them. We can't allow any to escape." As quickly as they had appeared, the creatures melted back into the forest, their footsteps fading into the distance as they went in search of whoever had fired that shot. We stood frozen in our circle of light for several minutes, hardly daring to believe that the immediate threat had passed. "What just happened?" Maya whispered, still clutching the kitchen knife with white knuckles. Before anyone could answer, we heard voices calling from outside. Human voices, speaking in normal tones with normal inflections. Through the broken doorway came 3 figures in hunting gear, led by a bearded man carrying a high-powered rifle with a scope. "Hello?" the man called out. We heard screaming and saw lights. Is everyone all right? I wanted to sob with relief. Thank God you're here, I managed. Our friend, she was taken. And there are things in the woods. We know, the man interrupted grimly. We've been tracking them for the better part of a week. Name's Officer Rodriguez, County Sheriff's Department. These are my deputies, Martinez and Chen. We've been getting reports of missing hikers and campers throughout this entire region. The next few hours passed in a blur of explanations, official statements and search parties. Officer Rodriguez and his team had been investigating what they initially thought was a serial killer or cult operating in the remote forest areas. The truth, as we learned, was far stranger and more terrifying. Started about 3 weeks ago, Rodriguez explained as his deputies swept the cabin for evidence. Hikers would go missing, then turn up days later acting different, violent, unable to speak coherently, attacking anyone who tried to help them. We've had to put 7 people in psychiatric holds, and they're all showing similar symptoms. What's causing it? Tyler asked, still shaking from our ordeal. Rodriguez shook his head. Honestly, we don't know. Could be some kind of drug in the water supply. Toxic algae. Maybe even a viral infection that affects brain chemistry. The CDC is sending a team, but it'll be days before we get any real answers. As dawn broke over the forest, we learned that Jessica had been found. She was alive but in a catatonic state, unable or unwilling to speak about what had happened to her. The doctors who examined her found no physical injuries, but her brain scans showed unusual activity in regions associated with empathy and self-recognition. It's like parts of her personality have just switched off. The physician explained to us later. She responds to basic stimuli, but there's no indication that she recognizes any of you or remembers anything about her previous life. The official explanation, when it finally came, was anticlimactic. A naturally occurring fungus, similar to the one that affects ants and other insects, had evolved to target human neural chemistry. The spores were released during the autumn months, affecting people who spent extended time in heavily forested areas. The symptoms included disorientation, loss of personal identity, and an overwhelming compulsion to spread the infection to others. But I knew better. I had seen those eyes, heard that laughter, felt the intelligence behind the coordinated attacks. Whatever had taken Jessica and turned her into something else, it was far more sophisticated than any fungus. It was purposeful, malevolent, and patient. We never spoke about the details of what we experienced that night. Not to the authorities and not to each other. How could we explain the whispers in the walls, the synchronized movements, or the way Jessica had tried to convert us to whatever she had become? Who would believe that we had witnessed something that existed at the intersection of science and nightmare? 3 years have passed since that Halloween night, and I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, remembering the sound of that inhuman laughter. Jessica remains in a specialized care facility, her condition unchanged. The doctors say she's stable but unresponsive, lost somewhere inside her own mind. The official reports were classified. The area around the cabin was quietly declared off limits to civilian access, and life went on as if nothing had happened. But I know the truth. I know that something ancient and hungry dwells in those dark woods, something that feeds on human consciousness itself. And sometimes on quiet nights when the moon is full, I swear I can still hear it whispering my name. The fog rolled in thick as I pulled up to the ranger station, the first rays of dawn barely penetrating the dense forest of towering evergreens. Another day, another patrol, but something felt different this morning as I grabbed my pack and headed inside. "Morning, Sam," I said to my fellow ranger as I entered. Sam looked up from his coffee, dark circles under his eyes. "Rough night?" I asked. He shook his head. "Weird dreams. That old Native American guy, John Redtree, stopped by yesterday, spouting his usual warnings, but it got to me for some reason." I frowned. John Redtree lived on the nearby reservation. He often came by with gloomy tales of those who walk like men but aren't. Old folklore and superstitions, we assumed. But something in Sam's tired eyes gave me pause. "Come on," I said. "I'll buy you breakfast in town. Then we'll walk the northern loop. Fresh air will do you good." Sam agreed and we headed out, the mist swirling around us. Little did I know the horrors that awaited us in the woods that day. The maples blazed crimson and orange as Sam and I hiked a trail, dew clinging to the ferns and underbrush. It was beautiful, but an eerie quiet hung over the forest. Not even a bird chirped. "So what did old John say that spooked you?" I asked. Sam hesitated. He said people have been disappearing more than usual. Not just hard-partying campers getting lost. Experienced hikers. He thinks something is out there stalking them. An icy chill crept down my spine, despite my jacket. We'd had an unusually high number of missing persons reports this year. I'd chalked it up to people being stupid in the woods. But what if there was more to it? "Look, John means well," I assured Sam. "But you can't let some old stories get to you. We'll keep our eyes peeled, but I'm sure there's a rational explanation." Sam nodded, unconvinced. Just then, a twig snapped in the undergrowth nearby. We both whipped around, pulling out our bear spray. But there was nothing there. "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to sound confident. But my gut told me something was wrong. The sooner we finished our patrol and got out of these woods, the better. The fog began to lift as the sun climbed higher, dappling the forest floor with light. But despite the brightening day, a shadow hung over my thoughts. John Redtree's warning gnawed at me. As if reading my mind, Sam spoke up. "Remember that kid who went missing 2 summers ago? The Eagle Scout?" I nodded grimly. Ethan Hayes, age 16. His troop had been camping in a remote part of the forest. One night, Ethan left his tent and never returned. We'd combed the area for a week but found no trace of him. It was like he vanished into thin air. "I ran into his mom in town last month," Sam continued quietly. "She's still desperate for answers. Thinks we didn't do enough to find Ethan." Guilt twisted my stomach. I knew we'd done all we could, but it still felt like failure. How many grieving families were out there, not knowing what happened to their loved ones? We walked on in heavy silence for a while. Around noon, we stopped at an overlook to eat our lunches, a sweeping view of gold and rust-colored hills stretching to the horizon. But even that did little to lift the unease that had settled over us. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the autumn stillness. It sounded close. Sam and I leapt to our feet, our hands on our radios. "Hello?" I called out. "This is the park ranger. Is someone there? Do you need help?" But only silence answered us. The hairs on my arms stood up. Something was very wrong. I unclipped my radio, about to call for backup, when I saw it. There, on the trail below us, was a single hiking boot lying on its side, as if it had been torn from someone's foot. Dark red blood stained the toe. "Wait here," I told Sam. "I'm going to check it out. Radio for backup and keep watch." My heart pounded as I approached the boot, my senses on high alert. Up close, I could see the leather was badly mangled, like it had been chewed. "Don't jump to conclusions," I told myself. It could be a bear attack, or maybe just a lost hiker, but something about that lone, bloody boot filled me with dread. I crept further down the trail, bear spray at the ready, searching for any other signs of a struggle, or the hiker the boot belonged to. But there was nothing. No torn clothing, no broken branches. The forest was utterly still. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around to see a dark shape moving between the trees. "Hello, I'm a park ranger. I'm here to help." The figure moved into a shaft of light, and I let out a breath. It was a man, haggard and disheveled, his flannel shirt and jeans caked with mud, but human. "Sir, are you all right?" "What happened?" I asked, lowering my bear spray. He stared at me, wide-eyed and mute with terror. Then he spoke in a hoarse whisper. "It's not human. You need to run, now." An inhuman shriek split the air, turning my blood to ice. The man turned and bolted. I stood frozen in shock for a split second before my training kicked in. I took off after him, crashing through the undergrowth and shouting into my radio. "Sam, we've got an emergency situation. I need you to—" A roar cut me off. The man screamed. I burst into a small clearing just in time to see a nightmarish creature pounce on him from the shadows. It was vaguely canine, but no dog I'd ever seen. Matted fur covered a gaunt, almost skeletal body. Razor claws tore into the man's flesh as he thrashed helplessly beneath the beast. But worst of all was its face. The thing had the head of a man, with intelligent, cruel eyes and a twisted snarl of a mouth. I swear it grinned as it turned its gaze on me, the man's blood dripping from its maw. My brain told me to run, but my body had other ideas. On instinct, I raised the bear spray and fired. The creature shrieked as the capsaicin-laced mist hit its eyes. In an instant, it bounded off into the woods, leaving me alone with the mangled remains of the hiker. Hands shaking, I reached for my radio. "Sam, we have a fatality, and we've got a big problem. Really big." "What the hell was that thing?" Sam demanded when I made it back to the lookout. The hiker's body slung over my shoulders. "And where is it now?" I shook my head, laying the man down. His face was unrecognizable. "I don't know," I admitted. "It was like a giant dog, but..." "But what?" Sam pressed. I swallowed. "It had a human face, Sam, like something out of a nightmare. And the way it looked at me, it was intelligent, cunning." Sam's face went white, just like John Redtree's stories. "You don't think..." Neither of us wanted to say it out loud. That Native American legends could be real. That something sinister and decidedly not human stalked these woods. "We need to call this in," I said hoarsely. "Search and rescue, local law enforcement, anyone who will listen. If that thing is what's been taking people..." I didn't need to finish the thought. Sam was already on the radio, frantically relaying the situation. I looked down at the dead man at my feet and felt my resolve harden. I didn't care if the higher-ups thought I was crazy. I wouldn't let this happen to anyone else. By mid-afternoon, the woods crawled with search teams, dogs, and even a helicopter. But the creature seemed to have vanished. All we found were a few more scraps of bloody clothing. As night fell, we made camp at the lookout post. I stoked the fire, casting uneasy glances at the tree line. Despite my exhaustion, I couldn't relax. Every snap of a twig made me reach for my gun. "Maybe we should have listened closer to Redtree's warnings," Sam murmured, poking at a can of beans. Before I could respond, a harrowing howl cut through the darkness. But it was no wolf or coyote. Judging by the wide-eyed look Sam gave me, he recognized it too. "That sounded close," he whispered. I stood up, cold sweat prickling my back. Then I heard it, a sound I'll never forget. A sound no animal could make. Laughter. Human laughter. Coming from the shadows just beyond our firelight, ice filled my veins as I raised my gun into the abyss with trembling hands. We were no longer the hunters, we were the prey. "Come on out, you bastard," I shouted, my voice tight with fear. The laughter cut off abruptly. Sam and I strained to hear over the pounding of our hearts. But the night was deathly silent. Even the usual chirping insects seemed to be holding their breath. 1 minute stretched into 2. The fire popped, making us both flinch. I began to wonder if I had imagined it. Then a rustling came from our left, like something large moving through the brush. I swung my gun around, finger hovering over the trigger. "There," Sam hissed. I caught a flash of pale skin and dark fur before the creature burst into the open, barreling straight for us with inhuman speed. Time seemed to slow down. I took aim, the beast's grotesque face filling my sights, its eyes boring into mine with uncanny intelligence. I fired. The gunshot cracked through the night, and the creature stumbled, dark blood spraying the autumn leaves. But impossibly, horrifically, it kept coming. "Move," I yelled, diving out of the way as the beast crashed into our camp in a whirlwind of claws and teeth. Embers scattered, and our tent collapsed as the creature thrashed, looking for its prey. In the chaos, I lost sight of Sam. I could only hope he had gotten clear. Snarling, the beast rounded on me, one eye a bloody ruin. Up close, it was even more nightmarish. Its wolfish body was humanoid, and far too gaunt. I could see every rib, every vertebrae straining against its hide. I raised my gun again, aiming for the head this time, but in a flash the creature lunged, faster than anything that big had a right to move. Claws raked my arm and my gun went flying. I scrambled backwards, groping for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a burning log from the scattered campfire. With a roar, I swung it at the beast's misshapen head. The creature shrieked as its mangy fur caught fire, the stench of burning hair filling the air. To my shock, it spoke. "You cannot stop us, human," it snarled, its voice a guttural growl that no man or animal could produce. "This is our land, our hunting ground." Then it turned and fled into the night, trailing flames and smoke. I sagged back against a tree, my whole body shaking. The creature's words rang in my ears. Us, our land. A horrible realization began to dawn on me. This beast was not alone. Did that thing just talk? Sam emerged from the underbrush, his eyes wild. I nodded mutely, clutching my bleeding arm. Speaking seemed beyond me at the moment. We need to get out of here, Sam said. Regroup with the others. Tell them what we saw. We can't leave, I said hoarsely. You heard it. There's more than one of those things out there, and they've been hunting people on this land for God knows how long. Sam looked like he wanted to argue, but the determined set of my jaw must have stopped him. He knew me well enough to know I wouldn't be swayed. Fine, he relented, but we can't take them on alone. We need help, weapons. I thought of John Redtree and his uncanny warnings. I think I know where to start. Dawn was just breaking as we pulled up to Redtree's small cabin on the outskirts of the reservation. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a raven perched on the mailbox cawed raucously at our approach. John answered the door on the second knock, unsurprised to see us. You've met the walkers, he said simply, taking in our haggard appearance. Is that what those things are called? I asked as he ushered us inside. The cabin was warm and smelled of sage. What the hell are they? John settled into a chair, his weathered face grim. They are not of this world. Not entirely. My people have stories, passed down through generations, of creatures that walk the line between man and beast, the embodiment of nature's fury. The embodiment of my nightmares. More like, Sam muttered. John ignored him. The old stories say they are a punishment for the disrespect and destruction man has wrought on the land. The walkers prey on those who venture too deep into the wild, consume them, become them. An icy horror crept through my veins as I remembered the creature's half-human face. The missing hikers, never found. Dear God, how do we stop them? I asked, my voice raw. Here John hesitated, conflict flickering in his dark eyes.
There are ways, old ways, but it will not be easy. These creatures, they can only be harmed by weapons imbued with magic, blessed by our shamans.
Sam exploded out of his seat. Magic? Are you serious? People are dying and you want to fight monsters with mumbo-jumbo? Sam, I warned. No, this is insane. We need firepower, not fairy tales. I'm calling for backup. Sam stormed out of the cabin. John turned to me, ancient sorrow etched into the lines of his face. Your friend. He does not understand. This is no ordinary beast you face. The walkers, they are old magic. I thought of the creature's human eyes boring into mine. The uncanny intelligence. As much as my rational mind rebelled against it, I knew John was right. This was beyond conventional understanding. I met his gaze steadily. Teach me. Night fell over the reservation as John led me into the woods, carrying a torch and a small leather satchel. We walked in silence, deeper into the trees than I had ever ventured before. The air grew heavy, watchful. I shivered despite my jacket. Here, John said, stopping in a small clearing. This is where the magic is strongest. He knelt and began to unpack his bag, laying out an array of herbs, bones, and strange fetishes. With deft hands he began to combine them, grinding the herbs with a mortar and pestle, murmuring words in a language I didn't recognize. As he worked, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was a charge to the air, like the stillness before a storm. The shadows pressed closer. They know we are here, John said calmly, not looking up from his task, making weapons against them. No sooner had he spoke than an ungodly shriek pierced the night. I spun, reaching for my gun, then cursed as I remembered I had left it behind, useless against the walkers. Quickly, John hissed, thrusting a small leather pouch into my hands. It thrummed with an odd energy. When the time comes, throw this at their feet. It will bind them for a short time. I wanted to ask what good a bag of magic herbs would do, but the words died in my throat as dark shapes detached from the trees. Not one walker, but three. Their grotesque bodies shining with scars and their human faces leering. Pathetic humans, one snarled. You dare challenge us? On our own land? This land was never yours, John said, rising to face them. In his hands he held a long carved staff. You are a plague, an infection. and we will cleanse you from this earth." The walkers howled with laughter, a nightmarish chorus. Then, as one, they charged. Claws and teeth flashed in the torchlight as John met them head-on, wielding his staff with surprising strength for an old man. I fumbled with the medicine pouch, my heart in my throat. One walker broke away, lunging for me with murderous intent. I dove aside, hitting the ground hard. I dove aside, hitting the ground hard. The walker's claws scored the earth where I had been a split second before. Heart pounding, I scrambled to my feet and faced the snarling beast, the medicine pouch gripped tight in my fist. "Throw it now," John yelled, grappling with the other two walkers. I didn't hesitate. With all my strength, I hurled the pouch at the creature's misshapen feet. The moment it struck the ground, a blinding flash lit up the clearing. The walker screamed, an agonized, inhuman sound. Glowing roots shot from the earth, ensnaring its legs and pinning it in place. Seizing my chance, I grabbed a fallen branch and brought it crashing down on the creature's skull with a sickening crunch. Once, twice, 3 times, until it moved no more. Panting, I turned to help John, but it was over. The old man stood tall amidst the bodies of the other 2 walkers, his magic staff gleaming with ethereal light. "Is that all of them?" I asked hoarsely. John shook his head. "No, there will always be more. The walkers are a manifestation of nature's wrath. As long as humans disrespect the land, they will return." I looked out into the dark trees, my mind reeling. The things I had seen, the horrors I had fought, they would haunt me forever. But I also knew I could never turn my back on this knowledge. I was a protector of these woods. It was my duty to keep the walkers at bay, no matter the cost. Together, John and I made our way out of the forest, battered and bone-weary. We had won the battle, but the war stretched endlessly before us. I thought of Sam and the other rangers, blissfully unaware of the supernatural threats lurking in the wilderness we had sworn to defend. It was time they learned the truth. Time to forge new alliances, new weapons, for I knew with grim certainty that the walkers would rise again, and we had to be ready. My boots crunched on the dry autumn leaves as I made my way through the shadowy forest. The sun had nearly set, casting an eerie orange glow through the canopy of bare branches overhead. An unnatural silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional gust of chilly wind that sent dead leaves skittering across the ground. I quickened my pace toward the campsite where the missing hikers had last been seen. When I emerged into the clearing, an uncanny stillness greeted me. 3 tents stood with their flaps whipping in the breeze. Clothing, backpacks, and supplies lay strewn about haphazardly, as if everyone had fled in a panic. Drawing closer, my blood ran cold. Dark stains splattered the torn nylon of the tents. The metallic scent of blood mingled with the loamy richness of the earth. No bodies, no signs of a struggle. Just this macabre scene frozen in time, like a crime scene photograph. What the hell happened here? A child's stuffed teddy bear lay abandoned near the cold embers of the fire pit. As I knelt to examine it, a jolt of dread shot through me. Jagged claw marks rent the soft fur, leaking clouds of polyester stuffing. No animal I knew of could have made those cuts. In the gathering darkness, a long, keening howl rose from deep in the woods, sending shivers down my spine. It sounded like no creature I'd ever encountered. Unholstering my pistol, I peered into the murky tree line, my heart hammering. 2 pinpricks of pale light, like eyes, glinted in the underbrush. Then they vanished. Something was out there in the darkness. Something that didn't belong in this world. And it was watching me. I tossed and turned in my sleeping bag that night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The forest beyond my tent rustled and whispered, as if conspiring against me. My mind churned with grim thoughts of the vacant, blood-soaked campsite. Where had the campers gone? What sort of beast was lurking in these woods? When dawn broke, cold and gray, I radioed back to the ranger station to report my findings. "Hank, you copy? I've got a real bad situation up here. Hikers are missing, campsite's a wreck. Looks like an animal attack, but I ain't ever seen anything like this." "Roger that," Hank replied, his gruff voice crackling over the radio. "Hate to say it, but we've had other disappearances in that area over the years. Folks around here don't much like to talk about it. Well, somebody better start talking." because there's a world of hurt out in these woods, and I'm stumbling around in the dark here. I took a long pull from my canteen, trying to steady my nerves. Listen, you didn't hear this from me, Hank said slowly, but the local tribes got legends about those hills. Say there's old evil spirits that roam around up there. Spirits that can look like men, or beasts. They take folks sometimes, especially when the moon's full. Christ almighty, Hank, you trying to give me a heart attack? I'd never put much stock in ghost stories and native lore, but after what I'd seen last night, I wasn't so sure. Later, in a small-town diner off the highway, I found myself sitting across from an ancient Native American man. His weathered face looked like a relief map of the hills themselves. When I told him about the missing hikers and the state of their camp, his dark eyes flashed with something like recognition. "Those who walk like men," he said cryptically, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Wendigos, hungry for human flesh. Once they catch the scent of blood, they never stop hunting." I left the diner with a heavy sense of dread. As I drove back toward the mountains, the old man's words echoed in my skull. I tried to tell myself it was just superstitious nonsense, but I couldn't shake the uncanny feeling that I was driving toward something truly malevolent, something that defied explanation. And as I would soon learn, my darkest fears didn't even touch the horror that awaited me in the shadows of the forest. For 2 days I combed the wilderness, searching for any sign of the vanished campers. With each passing hour, my hopes dwindled. The nights brought a primal, gripping terror. In the inky blackness between the trees, I sensed swift, stalking movements defying natural rhythms. My electric lantern sputtered and died, plunging me into blinding dark. I sprinted by instinct and memory, branches raking my flesh, unseen pursuers racing along my heels. When dawn broke, the true carnage revealed itself. I found the first ravaged deer carcass beside a burbling creek. Its belly hung open in glistening ropes, picked ribs thrusting to the pale sky. As I scouted further, more gruesome remains turned up. A bobcat's severed head ogled eyelessly from a stump. Bones and bloody bits of fur littered a stony gulch. The whole forest reeked of an abattoir. Yet even more unnerving was the way my equipment malfunctioned. Radios spat static. GPS blinked out at key moments. It felt as if the very frequencies of this area had been corrupted by some eldritch force. When a search helicopter whirred overhead, I frantically waved my arms and screamed. It continued unheeding, as though I were invisible. I could swear I heard the pilot's panicked voice squelching through my radio. "No visual, some kind of interference. We gotta turn back," before the signal devolved to a banshee shriek. That evening, the baying started, anguished human-like wails piercing the twilight. Thrashing and sobbing echoed through the scrub oaks and birches, interspersed with visceral tearing sounds. My skin prickled, a cold sweat drenching my back. I crouched in my tent, pistol aimed at the door, barely daring to breathe. Gnarled shadows crept across the walls like deformed fingers. Then the footfalls thundered past, minus a grotesque blend of animal galloping and humanoid scurrying, before fading to silence. I didn't sleep. How could I? Every fiber of my being thrummed with an instinctive primal panic. The kind our ancestors knew when saber-toothed cats prowled outside their caves. But this was worse, because all my training, all my rationality told me such monsters didn't exist in the modern world. Couldn't exist. Now I knew better. They were here, in my forest, stalking me with calculated cunning, playing with me, hunting me. Exhausted in body and spirit, I stumbled upon a narrow box canyon as the third morning dawned. Towering walls of striated stone rose up claustrophobically tight. I immediately wished I had given the uncanny crease in the landscape a wide berth. The cliffs fairly screamed with primitive etchings, faded ochre pictographs, cavorted and distorted animal-human forms. Skulls and femurs had been pounded into cairn-like stacks, and the petroglyphs, God, those petroglyphs. Frenzied slashes gouged the rock, as if enraged talons had raked it in ritualistic patterns. I couldn't look away from one central glyph that repeated over and over. A stick figure with a wolf-like head and disproportionately long, spindly limbs. Forcing down my revulsion, I scanned the scree at the base of the canyon. A glint of metal caught my eye. Crouching, I brushed aside gravel to reveal a dented camping cookpot and a torn, blood-stained jacket. The same brand as one I had seen at the ravaged campsite. So the lost hikers had come this way. Fresh terror jolted me as I studied the ground. A trail of footprints led deeper into the stony gulch, pressed into the damp earth. They started out as the familiar tread of hiking boots. Then, mid-stride, they distorted, lengthening, sprouting vicious claws, like a human transforming into a beast between one step and the next. I must have made some involuntary noise, because just then a scrabbling issued from a shadowed crevice to my left. I wheeled around, ripping my pistol from its holster. A pale, filthy arm shot out of the narrow crack, grasping weakly. "Help!" The voice was a rasping croak, choked with terror and dehydration. I reached into the crevice, clasped the clammy hand, and pulled. A young man, no more than 20, staggered out and collapsed against me. His eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, clothes hanging off him in shredded tatters. "Easy now," I soothed, even as my own heart jackhammered. "You're safe. I've got you." "No, not safe." He shuddered violently, fingers clawing. "They'll be back. Always come back." Lowering him to the ground, I uncapped my canteen and let water trickle over his cracked lips. He gulped convulsively, dribbling down his stubbled chin. "Who will be back? What happened up here?" His eyes snapped to mine with wild intensity. "Monsters. They killed everyone." A moan escaped him and he doubled over. I struggled to process his fractured account. He described the initial attack, how the shambling nightmares had struck without warning, torn his friends limb from limb with terrifying ease. Their guttural snarls and the screams. Oh God, the screams. The horrors he had witnessed defied belief. Yet one look at the man's shattered psyche told me this was no campfire tale. He had stared into the abyss, and it had stared back, with ravenous, glowing eyes, and a predator's grin. I built a small fire at the base of the cliff, hoping the light and warmth would bring a measure of comfort to the quaking survivor as evening stole over the canyon. He huddled near the flames, knees drawn up to his chest, rocking back and forth. No matter how I tried, I couldn't coax from him a name or any details about himself. Shock had stolen his identity, leaving only a husk animated by trauma. As the fire popped and hissed, I studied his scratched and bruised face in the dancing light, tried to imagine the horrors he had endured. Were his friends truly gone, shredded and devoured by some unnatural abomination? It sounded preposterous, impossible. Then I remembered the uncanny sights and sounds I myself had witnessed over the preceding days. The spine-chilling howls, the sense of being watched by malevolent eyes. Whatever lurked in this forest, it was no mere animal. Some primal intuition, ancient as encoded self-preservation behavior, screamed at me to flee. But I couldn't abandon this broken man, or the others, if any still lived. So I sat up with my pistol cocked and ready, watching the narrow entrance to the canyon. Moonlight painted the world beyond in slivers of icy blue and impenetrable shadow. An owl hooted forlornly. Wind keened through the rocks. Seconds ticked by with excruciating slowness. When it came silently. One moment the canyon lay still and empty. The next, a towering silhouette filled the gap, blotting out the stars. The thing stepped into the firelight, and my breath seized in my throat. Dear God, no living creature on earth looked like that. It stood on two legs, but the proportions were grotesquely elongated and askew. Sinewy, ashen gray flesh stretched over jutting ribs and an emaciated frame. Lanky arms ended in scythe-like talons. Worst of all was the head, a hellish fusion of wolf and deer skull, dominated by a prognathic maw bristling with jagged teeth. Membranous, tattered ears flicked above deep-set eye sockets that glowed with a feral, flickering emptiness. I raised my pistol and fired, the shot deafening in the confined space. I know I hit the thing square in its vile chest, but it merely flinched. Then that awful death's head swiveled toward me, eyes blazing like cold gashes in the fabric of reality. Behind me, the survivor shrieked. A high, unraveling sound ripped from the depths of madness. He scrabbled to his feet, clawing at the unyielding cliff face. No, 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 not again. The Wendigo. For what else could it be? This storybook demon sprung to nightmarish life, threw back its head and howled with obscene glee. Then it pounced, faster than any human eye could track. I dove aside, years of training taking over. Sparks burst behind my eyes as I slammed into the canyon wall. Dazed, I could only watch as the looming horror fell upon the young man. His scream pierced the night, climbed to an unbearable crescendo, then cut off with a wet, ripping crunch. In that moment, I knew true despair. I had failed this poor soul. Failed as a ranger, as a rescuer, as a human being. Now I would surely join him, torn to quivering gobbets by an insatiable monstrosity. Through tear-blurred eyes, I saw the Wendigo feast, slavering, on the kill. Gore pattered to the stones, hellish shadows capered on the cliff walls, cast by the guttering fire. The scene branded itself into my brain with all the lurid permanence of trauma. Then, suddenly, the creature paused. Its gore-streaked muzzle lifted, swinging from side to side, sniffing the air, seeking a new scent. My scent. It growled, a guttural register more felt than heard, blood dripping from its jaws. It stepped toward me, one taloned hand outstretched, and I ran, heart pounding, gasping for breath. I plunged headlong through the phantasmagoric forest. Gnarled branches snatched at my clothes. Jagged rocks slashed my palms. None of it mattered. Only flight, primal and urgent as a hunted deer. Behind me, crashing footfalls and strident howls shredded the night. Glimpsing back, I saw the Wendigo loping after me, all wrong angles and terrifying speed. Lungs afire, a razor stitch in my side. I broke from the tree line into sudden open space. Skidding to a halt at the crumbling lip of a mining shaft, a surreal sight greeted me. An abandoned prospector camp moldered under the ghostly moon, half devoured by choking vines. Rusted pickaxes and dented cookware littered the ground, and at the camp's heart gaped a black-fanged maw, a cave mouth leading into the bowels of a limestone cliff. The Wendigo's banshee shriek pierced the air, far too close. No time to hesitate. Pulse thudding in my skull, I plunged into that Stygian hole, groping blindly in the dark. My questing fingers found a damp, rocky wall. I followed it, stooped half double, harried by the echoes of monstrosity at my back. Pale light glimmered ahead. The cave opened into a chamber, roof lost in shadow. Animal bones crunched underfoot. A charnel reek blasted my nostrils, triggering the gag reflex. Swallowing bile, I raised my flickering flashlight. What it illuminated defied sanity. A shrine of madness, erected to primal depravity. Skulls. Dozens of human skulls piled in grotesque fused heaps. Broken, fleshless arms and legs thrust from the walls like hellish ornamentation. In sacred niches stood a grisly array of objects. Hiking boots, tattered shirts, shattered GPS units, all crusted in old blood. At the chamber's rear, a vast flat slab bore arcane sigils and glyphs, scrawled as if by a crazed hand, an altar to foulest sacrifice. My brain reeled, struggled to process the spectacle of death. Questions flooded me, even as my skin crawled with horror. How long had this been here? How many victims had the Wendigo claimed over the years? What eldritch intelligence drove it to collect these macabre trophies? Slumped against the altar, I spied two human shapes and my heart clenched. Survivors, I thought of the lost campers, prayed these might be them. Warily approaching, flashlight beam wavering, I called out, "Hello? I'm a ranger. I'm here to help." One figure stirred, whimpered. Slowly it unfurled from a fetal curl. In the stark light, I saw a woman's face. Ashen, streaked with grime, eyes blank beneath a tangled thatch of hair. She looked right through me, catatonic with shock. Her male companion fared worse. He remained motionless, propped against the blood-smeared stone. Only the shallow rise and fall of his chest indicated life. A quick once-over revealed festering gashes, the flesh around them hot with infection. The Wendigo's hunting howl bellowed from the cave mouth. Cursing, I slung the semi-conscious man across my shoulders in a fireman's carry. With my free hand, I hauled the unresponsive woman to her feet. We have to move now. The passageways twisted before us, a stony labyrinth. I blundered on, taking turns at random, pulse drumming a panic tempo. The monster's squalling cries distorted weirdly, seeming to come from all directions at once. Stalactites clawed at my face. The dank air thickened, harder to suck into straining lungs. Just as my knees began to buckle under the double burden, a waft of night wind kissed my cheek. There, a fissure, leading up to faint starlight. Driving my body to a final effort, I squeezed through, pulling my dazed charges behind me. We stumbled out into another part of the forest, far from the mining camp. I didn't stop to get my bearings. Hoisting the survivors once more, I crashed through the underbrush in what I prayed was the direction of my truck. Let it still be there. Let the keys still turn the ignition. Let the Wendigo have sated its bloodlust for now. At last, with an almost religious gratitude, I spied the glint of chrome through the foliage. Nearly weeping, I hustled the traumatized man and woman into the cab, turned the key, and exhaled a ragged gasp as the pickup roared to life. Stamping the accelerator, I sped off down the overgrown logging road in a spray of gravel. Deliverance. It seemed too good to be true. And of course it was. For a fleeting eternity of minutes, we bounced and clattered along that rough track, night-shrouded trees whipping past. I gulped air, tried to slow my galloping heart. In the passenger seat, the survivors huddled like broken dolls, unspeaking. Their 1,000-yard stares told me they had endured true nightmare and might never emerge from it. I rounded a switchback, tires fighting for traction. The headlights flared across a scene out of hell. The rutted road ahead roiled with shadowy figures. Not quite human, not quite beast. Lupine heads and attenuated limbs glistened wetly in the sallow beams. Eyes flashed like rime-coated rubies. The pack of Wendigos milled and capered, blocking our escape with their very presence. Shit. Shit, shit. I pounded the steering wheel as the engine stalled, sputtered out. Tried the key again. Nothing. Not even a click. Some uncanny agency seemed to have killed the truck, left us stranded. The pack stalked forward, a leisurely sort of menace in their movements. They knew we were trapped, defenseless, lips skinned back from jagged maws in what looked horribly like grins. My flashlight flickered, dimmed. Scrabbling under the seat, I found the flare gun. Loaded it with numb fingers. God, let this work. I leaned out the window, aimed at the lead abomination's head, and fired. The flare seared across the tableau like a comet, brilliant red. It struck the Wendigo square between its malevolent eyes and ricocheted off, spinning away into the darkness. The thing threw back its awful head and laughed. A barking, squalling sound, demented with glee. Then it lunged, talons outstretched. I twisted the key one more time, sobbing a wordless prayer. The pickup roared to life. I punched the accelerator to the floor, and we jolted forward. Momentarily startled, the Wendigos fell back. Claws screeched across the hood, but somehow the truck muscled through, scattering the pack like ninepins. In the rearview mirror, I watched the monstrosities regroup, milling in the red wash of taillights. Then, as one, they bounded after us, loping on all fours, steadily gaining ground. The road seemed to narrow, trees pressing in on either side. Keening howls and guttural snarls pursued us, the sound of a predator taunting its prey. I downshifted, urged more speed from the straining engine. Sweat stung my eyes, panic clawed at my throat. On and on, we raced through that primordial wood. The implacable horrors always just behind. Time lost meaning, swallowed by the frenzied chase. I existed only as a nerve-stripped creature, every cell locked on the singular goal of survival. It couldn't last. Not at this breakneck pace. Through unfamiliar terrain. Sure enough, as I wrenched the wheel around another blind turn, the road dropped out from under us. An old bridge rotted through. We sailed into space, seemed to hover, then crashed into the stony creek bed with a scream of tortured metal. The impact whiplashed through me, and the world went mercifully black. I don't know how long I drifted in that oblivion. Snatches of consciousness filtered back slowly, painfully. The night breeze on my face, the gurgle of the creek, a metallic tang on my tongue. When I finally pried open my eyes, watery dawn light greeted me. The truck lay crumpled at the base of a steep embankment, accordion folded around an outcropping of schist. I had been flung halfway out the shattered windshield, saved from impalement by some small miracle. Every joint and sinew shrieked as I levered myself to hands and knees. Reality hit like a sledgehammer. The Wendigos. The crash. Where were the survivors? I found them sprawled a few yards away, thrown clear by the impact. The man lay ominously still, limbs akimbo. When I pressed fingers to his throat, they met only doughy skin already cooling to match the rock beneath. Beside him, the woman stirred and whimpered. I cradled her head, checked for obvious wounds. Shoot, it's okay, you're safe now, they're gone, praying it was true. She blinked at me, some dim awareness penetrating her stupor. Licked dry, split lips. Gone? A croak, frail with disbelief. I think so. We lost them when the bridge collapsed. I glanced up the steep bank, seeing no signs of pursuit. Looked like the monsters couldn't or wouldn't follow us down here. Maybe running water repelled them, like in the old stories. I laid my palm to her cheek. You're going to be all right. I'll hike out till I find cell reception. Call for help. Everything's going to be all right. She cut me off, voice pitching higher. All right? She dissolved into ragged, unhinged laughter. Nothing is ever going to be all right. All the tension, the trauma, and visceral terror boiled over at once. She thrashed against me, howling, sobbing, incoherent with hysteria. I held her awkwardly, made soothing sounds, until her spasms subsided into exhausted stillness. She lay slackly, eyes staring through me. They're out there, she whispered, in the woods, waiting, always waiting. After that, she spoke no more. Not on the long trudge out of the ravine. Not when I flagged down a logging truck and begged the use of a satellite phone. Not when the EMTs loaded her onto a stretcher, vacant gaze fixed on horrors only she could see. In the weeks that followed, I underwent my own hell. The disbelief of my superiors, the ridicule of the official investigation team, who found no trace of the mining camp or the Wendigo's grisly shrine. The way my colleagues' eyes slid askance when I entered a room, marking me as unstable, unfit. Worst were the night terrors. I would jolt awake, sheets drenched in icy sweat, the echo of predatory howls still ringing in my ears. Flashbacks ambushed me at odd moments. A mall Santa's white beard and red suit suddenly transposed into a Wendigo's flayed skull and bloody pelt. They never found the other campers' remains. Just a few scraps of tent fabric, some scattered belongings. The official line was a bear attack. The bodies dragged off and scavenged. I knew better. Knew they had been harvested, transformed into gory trophies for the monsters' amusement. So I sit here now and chronicle this, my final testament. Because the truth must be told, even if none believe it, especially if none believe it. Someone must stand witness to the depravity that lurks in the primordial corners of our world, to the horrors that stalk the borderlands between myth and reality. I've lost my job, my reputation, maybe my sanity. Small prices to pay, in the grand scheme. The survivors, if you can call them that, will never recover. Their families grieve without closure, and something wicked still slouches through the deep woods, red eyes aglow and belly never full. As for me, I'll be heading back up that mountain soon. One man, one rifle, a fool's crusade most likely. But I can't just walk away, can't unknow the things I've seen. If I don't return, let this be my epitaph. I tried to stand against the dark, tried to protect the unwary from the hungry shadows. In the lonely nights to come, if you hear a keening wail from the wilderness, bar your door, say a prayer, and don't look too long into the forest, because it looks back,